Hello and welcome back to my Astro Imaging Journey channel. As you can tell from the title of the video, this is not how any of this works. A little throwback to, I believe, a Geico commercial. Was it a Geico commercial? I don't know. From a few years back. Anyways, yeah, let's talk about the videos that I've just put up recently. I've been having issues. The Pinwheel Galaxy, that was just a bad noise profile, and the banding that went across the top of the Galaxy just threw everything off. So I got to go back and reintegrate my subs, figure out where I went wrong there. But I'm more concerned about the nebula. You know, the Cat's Eye Nebula, and I did a couple test ones on some other nebula. Things were just not looking right, and I couldn't figure out why. And then it kind of dawned on me, well, how many exposures do I need for some of these targets? You know, when I started this, I just went for 8 hours. You know, give me 8 hours worth of viable data on a target and let's go. So if we go down to right in here, nope. So my old times, you know, for clusters, I was doing 480 exposures at 1 minute each. That is 8 hours exactly. For galaxies, I was doing 240 exposures at 2 minutes, and for nebula, 96 exposures for 5 minutes. All of that added up to 8 hours per target, and I've been driving along. But I didn't feel confident enough to go after nebula until more recently, and 480 exposures was good for the clusters, 240 was good for the galaxies, so I thought everything was on track, and then I go and try to process the Cat's Eye Nebula, and bam, slap in the face, right? Just signal to noise wasn't there, the noise profile was way too high, things just weren't right. So I decided to just do a little reading, and what I found was what's called the rule of squares, or some people call it the rule of square roots. And it has to do with signal to noise. Okay, and here's 2 links to some articles written by Jerry Ludrigus. I hope I didn't butcher your name, Jerry, but I'm not good with names. Anyways, and let's bring up those articles here. The first one, he's talking about signal to noise, and if we come down to it, he's given a 10 is the square root of 100, and long story short, you can go and read this if you want. If you want something to have a signal to noise that is 2 times as good as your baseline, you are going to need either 4 seconds more exposure time if you have a 1 second baseline exposure, or 4 stacked images as opposed to a single image. And if you want 3 times, so that would be 9 versus 1, and 9 exposures versus 1. And I started looking at that, and Well, at 480 exposures, I am well over 15 times the signal to noise ratio, or SNR, as a single frame. My galaxies are about 17 times the SNR of a single, and my nebula, well, there might be my problem. With 96 exposures, I'm in between 9 and 10, right? So what are we looking at when we're trying to expose? Well, clusters are mostly stars, so they saturate quickly, so we don't need longer exposures. And as a result, we can get away with relatively fewer exposures and get a good result. The galaxies, well, if we want to reveal that structure, we're going to have to expose longer and saturate the stars. If we don't saturate the stars, then we're not going to get the structure, and it's a balancing act. Nebula, well, in this particular case, from what I've seen, with very few exceptions, we don't have any choice but to saturate the stars in order to get that nebulosity we want in most of those targets. So, like it says here, it's a balancing act. And I just threw up a quick table here. 1 is our baseline. If we want 2 times the baseline, we need 4 exposure, or 4 times whatever we're looking at. So if we want to look at exposure, number of exposures, if we want 5 times the baseline, then we need 25 exposures versus 1 of the baseline. And that would also apply to the exposure length. So if 1 second is our baseline, then 25 seconds will yield us a 5 times signal to noise. So using that chart, I looked at my old settings. Again, I've gone through some of these. With clusters, I was getting good detail, good star detail, and most were not saturated. Most of the fainter stars. Your brighter stars, yeah, they were pretty saturated. But as we can say here, clearly way too many exposures. That is over 20 times the SNR. So I could probably back off a little bit from there. The next was the galaxies, 240 exposures at 2 minutes. Saturation of the stars, but getting good detail, good being relative here, in the structure of the galaxy. For my setup, this was pretty good. And with the nebula, 96 exposures at 5 minutes, and stars were always saturated. Some nebulosity was seen, and that varied by target, and it's clearly not enough exposures. So I looked at this chart and I went through the info that Jerry had provided, and lo and behold, this is pretty much what I'm thinking I'm going to go with for the next few targets. The clusters, I'm going to try to, everybody, I'm going to be doing, or for everybody, I'm going to be doing 225 exposures. I want to keep the 60, 120, or 300 seconds, and what's going to change is the total time for acquisition. So for clusters, I'm no longer going to be concerned about 8 hours. It's going to be just shy of 4 hours. Galaxies are still going to be a little shy of 8 hours, but those nebulas, now I'm going to need about 22 hours, 21 hours of data. So the nebulous objects, hopefully that's the right term, will require a lot more exposures. And from what I'm reading from other astroimagers, that is entirely true. So let me go back to my browser, and one question I had was, well, what would be the ideal exposure for a given target? And well, this was the only real calculator I could find, and it is entirely astro imaging cameras in the drop down list. ZWOs, ATIC, QSI, QHY, they're all astro imaging centered or focused cameras. So there just isn't anything, so it's all trial and error. And so far, the 60 seconds, 120 seconds, and 5 minutes have been yielding me some decent results. Maybe I'll have to tweak that in the future. But for now, I'm going to stick with that and adjust my number of exposures and not try to change too much up at one time. I'm sorry, I've got the sniffles, feeling a little sick today. So next thing we want to talk about is ISO. I am running a DSLR. We have the ability to change the ISO, and I'm sure a lot of you have read out there that, oh, go to 1600, you'll be fine. Higher's better. Do 3200, do 6400. Not necessarily. It's camera dependent, and I use 800 for a reason. I did some testing of my own with the noise profile and looking at the histogram early on, and 1600, maybe double the value, double the light, so to speak, double the sensitivity. I had more than double the noise. So I opted to stick right at 1600 in the very beginning and not go above that. But then we go down here and I found the DxO mark, because unlike the sensors that we put into the astro imaging cameras, DSLR sensors, we don't get the same data that we need. We don't get the full well capacity or the quantum efficiency or all these other variables we need to know about our sensors for astro imaging that most photographers really don't care about that much when they're taking traditional photography, street, nature, sports, things of that nature. So we just don't get the info. But what we do have is one resource called DxOMark, and they do a bunch of testing on these cameras, these DSLRs, and the T6i right there, as you can see in their testing for low light ISO 919 and above, basically, or below rather, is where you need to be. So that would be 919 would be right in there. and that would be the red line will be coming across. So there's our green line at the value of 10. Looks like it's crossing that closer to 1600. So we would probably be okay if we went to 1600, but 800 is where, after reading through a lot of this information, I just felt, looking at these charts, as you can see here, red is our, yellow. And once again, yep, right about the same point. So, I was going through a lot of the information on here and a couple other websites about the T6i, which is the camera I'm using, and determined that 800 ISO gave the best results. And then once you get to 1600, that's where the noise starts to impact more. It's less flatlined in the curve, so that's when I opted to go to 800 ISO and stick there. And I think I'm going to stick there for a while. But what does that mean? Well, that means it's a trade-off. Now, when I first started out, I didn't have the focal reducer on. And without the focal reducer, the scope is an f10, an f ratio. Okay, and now we're getting into a little bit more photography related if you're into that. But if I put the focal reducer on, now I'm at an f7. That is one full stop of light, meaning at f7, twice as much light is getting through as f10. So that means everything else being equal, the picture would be 2 times brighter. But that kind of worked out in my favor because now I was going from 1600 ISO down to 800. So everything is a balancing act. Your focal length, or not focal length, that's part of your focal f ratio. Your f ratio, your ISO, and your shutter speed. So if you want something to be twice as bright, but you keep the same ISO and focal f ratio, then you need to double your shutter speed. Keep it open longer and go from 30 seconds to 60 seconds. Or if you want to stay at 60 seconds on your exposure, then you're going to have to either drop your focal ratio, which would, in this particular case, go from an f10 to an f7, or you could have your ISO. Again, we're looking at keeping the same image quality, brightness, by changing a couple options. So there's a lot of good information out there. Go YouTube it. I'm not doing a good job of explaining it, but at the end of the day, it's a balancing act. Focal ratio, your f number, your f-stop, aperture rating, they also call it, ISO, and exposure length. So let's go back. Yep, that was the last of that. So what does that mean? That all means that I am using new settings going forward. Should not impact me too much with the clusters and the galaxies. Galaxies are going to be pretty much the same. My clusters are going to take me half as long, and we will see. I might do a test run on just pick one of the upcoming clusters that I already have pre-processed. Maybe I'll process them. You know, previously I was having 200 or 480 exposures, so I could cut that in half, go down to 240 of the quote-unquote approved images, and just do a test run on 240 as opposed to 480 and see what I get. You know, the big question is going to be nebula. Any types of nebula that I try to capture. 21 hours. That's a long time, especially with the DSLR. But we will try it out. So, you know, I learned something last night after getting everything done and putting all this together. So, hopefully, this is the right information. Hopefully, this is going to help me out. We will see. Keep in tune to see what happens on the next nebula target. Let me pull up the report for the next couple days. As you can see, it looks like we're going to have some fairly clear skies tonight, so I can get started. Hopefully tomorrow night. Looks like it's going to be a pretty nice week, actually. But the problem is, look at how short that window is. And actually the moon comes up around 1 o'clock in the morning. It's about 50% illuminated tonight. So I've got a short window for nebula tonight and tomorrow night, maybe the next night. And then I can start going full night, but even full night, as you can see, roughly 10 o'clock till a little bit after 4 o'clock. So that's about 6 hours. That's not a whole lot of time. So, we'll see. But I do have a couple nebula in the target list. So we will hopefully be able to complete one in a couple of weeks, and let's see what we end up with. So with that, I'm going to say thanks for watching. I hope this turns out to be right, and if so, I hope you get some value out of it as well.
Thanks for watching yet another episode from the Astromedia Journey channel. Really appreciate your viewership. In our upper right, we have the latest video that I have posted prior to this one. Down in the lower right, we have what YouTube thinks you will enjoy. Below is a subscription link. Please hit that like button, subscribe if you so choose, ring that bell if you want to get notified of something new, and as always, thank you, clear skies. Remember to